It's so nice to be with everyone here, including so many people who are part of Judy's family. And that family is growing all the time, I think, especially with you here at LACMA, Judy, painting in the galleries. And I think you seem to be gathering friends and family quickly. So this is an exciting chance to talk directly about um, mural making and this bit of history and Agnès Varda's film as a jumping off point to that. Some of you may remember we had a beautiful exhibition of Agnès Varda here at LACMA, in which there was a whole section devoted to this film. We screened the film then, and I got a chance to work with her then. She made this beautiful house of film for us. But I wonder if we can go back to that time, Judy, because you're looking back on it. You're still painting the Great Wall. Here presently, some of us here helping out. So, I mean, maybe you can reflect a little bit just to start, because there you were with Agnes. You did tell me a beautiful story about her and the Great Wall and being there. But can you reflect a little on that time and her interest in mural making and the spirit of that time that she tries to capture here?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Agnes was just an amazing artist. Um, she wasn't really a documentarian in the way that you conventionally think about that. So I didn't confer with her. We were not discussing how she would represent me. There was no discussion, right? She showed up with an entourage. She wrote me a letter in advance and said, would I be willing to be filmed? And she was coming to LA and to do something about the murals. And I said, of course, because literally I said, anybody who wants to come, if you want to go into the river with me, have at it, right? Let's see how long you last, right? And so Agnes showed up, and as I said, no, she didn't confer at all, and I knew that she was going to be an artist using this as part of the material, and I didn't know how I would be represented at all. Um, the story I was telling earlier is a story about how Agnes came down, and you could see in her eyes as she was looking around what she was putting together. She was composing it in her head about how she would represent the imagery. And mostly what she really loved was the scale. She loved the fact that she could see down to a pinpoint in the mural from one end to the other. She wanted to get engaged with the kids, and I didn't know what they would say because I had a lot of at-risk kids, and they could be quite dicey. They could say anything. Um, so I said, okay, whatever happens, happens, right? You give it up to the universe and to Agnes, right? And she did her filming, and then she said, this is really good, but I'm not done. So I knew she'd be coming back, and that we'd be welcoming her at her will, right? And the story is that the day after, or within the days of her being there was a flash flood of a hurricane that came up from Mexico, and it was this momentous moment in the history of the Great Wall. Um, the water started to come down in buckets, and we had finished painting for the day, and I had driven back to the west side into Venice, and was there with Eva Cockcroft, a wonderful mural painter, and some of my team members. The kids had all gone home, and all of a sudden I got a call saying, everything is gone, and B is gone too. And that it had to do with the kids going into the river to try to save our trucks and our paint and our materials because water was coming down and it was going to take it away. They were instructed never to go in the river when it was raining, not even to go near it. And of course, that's exactly what they did. They lowered themselves in ropes, they put themselves in the river, and they put themselves in jeopardy. They saved our trucks, they saved our paint, and B did not get out. That was the the one person who didn't get out. And she was washed down the river 6.5 miles, and was rescued by helicopter with an amazing man on the cable. And Bee lived to tell the story, and she has been the director of the Great Wall Institute. And this next
And Ben right here.
right here. So actually, you can come any day, and you might see her bringing in cupcakes. So Agnes actually missed the flood, and and I remember her time there specifically around this particular set of events. So yes, we survived that, and that is one of the reasons why you'll see us here at LACMA. we're no longer painting in the river. We're trying to find a safer way for us to be working and not in 118 degrees
Yeah,
with
good light,
weather,
air
air
conditioning.
conditioning,
We have a lot of
right,
like creature comforts,
bathrooms,
bathrooms, restaurant nearby.
all that kind of stuff that is like normal stuff for human beings. But literally, my team, which is over 400 young people, hundreds of other historians and community members, are all part of the process that have created the work that you'll see at LACMA now, and also what you'll see in the river.
Yeah. Uh, which we're going to talk more about. And Pilar, you are a Judy Baca aficionado from the beginning, right? You can say something about that, but you've become a true art historian of the period. You know a lot of artists that are in the film and have studied their work. And I wonder if you can talk about your own passion to connect with Judy and this work that you've spent so much time studying, and now at the Lucas Museum of Narrative Art. I know it will become, some of this work will become part of that story of narrative art.
Yes, I mean, once upon a time, I was a Chicana muralist myself, which is how I arrived in Los Angeles many moons ago, around 2001. And I, came to LA not really seeking to live here, to work here, or anything of that sort, but I was here just visiting and decided I would look up the muralists here, and I found my way to Spark and found my way to Judy. And Judy provided me with an opportunity to work uh, on restoration of her mural project, the World Wall. So that led me to my time in Los Angeles, which now spans 2 decades, and to a really deep investment in the kind of practice that Judy represents, and a really deep and involved viewership, kind of participation alongside your work, Judy, and being there at different inflection points too. We were just backstage kind of remembering when certain moments, happened, when there was a moratorium that was placed on murals in LA, and I was at Spark when that news came down the pipeline, or when the Neighborhood Pride mural program, when the funding for that was pulled, and I was also at Spark at that time. So, I mean, I've been around to kind of, live alongside you in many ways, and hear from you, about the impact of that, and understand like what that means now to an arts organization that's 45 years deep, entrenched in the work that you're doing in communities throughout Los Angeles. So, for me, as someone who was making my way on my course of becoming, an artist to a curator to an art historian, and now an arts professional in the capacity that I am, currently, it's really, become very entrenched in what I want to do and the type of work that I want to pursue and the stories that I want to tell, and I feel really critical and important. And this legacy that you represent, the stories that you've been attached to, and the generation of artists that you also, have come up with, that are you see here in the Mur Murs film. I mean, that's a history that we're collectively writing with many scholars in this room that work at this museum, collaborators that I've had the great pleasure of working with over the course of my career. But now, thinking about the many generations of artists and young scholars that you've influenced, that now we're kind of standing back and looking at, a field of art history, and especially, the evolution of Chicanx and Latinx art, and the way that that it has become more supported within discourse. That there's more scholarship to point to. We've been working to build that up.
And so now you have this amazing position as curator of this brand new huge museum, which wants to tell the story of narrative art from cave painting to beyond into the present. And so it's interesting. How do you, with your deep connection, place this? It's not a movement, it's a way of thinking into that bigger history. Have you been thinking about that? I know that Lucas Museum acquired the large collection of drawings of the Great Wall, right? So those are in your collection now. They're part of the museum, and it's so great that that's going to be a big part of that history. Yes.
You can applause.
Applause.
Please, please clap for that, because it's absolutely incredible that we have the entire archive of the Great Wall of Los Angeles. So that is a monumental archive of hundreds of documents that represent the history of Judy's work around this project. And so that's something that we're going to be able to work with for years and years and years to come, to be able to tell the story not only at the time in the Tonga Wash, past and the development of that project in that time, but its future and being able to connect back. But I think to your question, Michael, I mean, what are we trying to connect to? We're trying to connect to the stories that we tell, the stories that are important, to us as human beings. And what are those large, arcs of narrative that make us human? Why do we continue to gravitate to this need to, represent imagery in the way that we do? And I think, we're compelled as human beings really to return time and time again to these meta narratives, the socio-political content, these things that really that drive us to connect to each other. And I think that is really represented in the work that Judy does.
And it's fair to say, Judy, that part of the reason you started your painting in this way, well, it was for the at-risk youth that you were working with, and then you said it became your life. But you were always in this storytelling idea. It was writing large stories that had not been told, right? Isn't this? I mean, even in Agnès Varda, I think in the film, it's about the question of margins. She herself felt working at the margins, as even in cinema in Paris and here. But I think I'm interested in that idea of the urgency to tell stories that have not been told. I think that's a lot of the impetus for the Great Wall, right?
Oh, absolutely. And I just have to take a moment and say that she's also a good painter.
Right.
Right. And I say no better historian than somebody who's come through the trenches, right? No, absolutely. My thought to begin with was that I didn't really have the pressure of thinking that I was going to be a famous artist, or thinking that as a woman I would have the agency to be a maker of monuments. There were no examples. There was no place to look and say, oh, I want to be like that. What there was absence. And so in the absence, I could invent myself in any way I wanted. And so in a sense, there was a certain freedom to that. And what I knew was that I grew up I was born in Watts, to a single mother who was raising me on her own. And I grew up in Pacoima. And so this was not outreach for me to think about this. This was inreach. This was the story of my life, the story of my family's life, the people around me. And so I wanted to say something to them, to my family and to these people that would matter to them, right? And I didn't want to, I was sort of encouraged in the 70s as an art student to be engaged in minimalist art and to look at the way that a line would be made with a gesture, and to understand color theory. All of those things came in handy as a muralist, but they were not the focus of what I wanted to do. I wanted to make it possible for my abuelita to look at the work and say, oh, I get it, I understand it. Because on the night of my graduation from the university in the arts, my grandmother said, what do you do? What was all this about, right? As the first person educated in the family. And so I put the portfolio in her lap, and then I realized that it was useless to her. It was completely, and she just looked at me. She said, oh, Mika, what's this for? What is this for? I mean, you can't cook it. You can't make dinner for everybody. You can't, what is this going to do? It's not going to elevate us in some way. So then I really set about thinking about what would work in terms of looking at the skill I had and knowing that there was a revolution going on, that we were fighting for our rights, that we were trying to elevate our people. All I had was my hands that had been trained as an artist. So how could they be put to work that would do this work, that would relate to my family and to the people I loved and to the neighborhoods I came from? And that's how it started. And of course, my mother says, Hortensia, who was known to her sort of poignant remarks, she said, you did it to get even with the valley.
Fair enough. So since we're all trained as artists here, actually, let's talk a little
I love
about
that.
mural painting. Okay, so we're obviously you have this urgency to get even with the valley, to get even with art history, with history, tell new stories. We can talk a little more about that, but also, so you talked about your minimalist training, but mural painting is something very different, and we know that from even the study you were in Mexico and studied mural painting, the Punto system. Looking at a mural is so different than looking at a painting in a frame or a drawing that has limits, because you have to carry the eye through this long space, and you have to make it differently. Can you say something? I mean, it's so beautiful to see painting. There you are, painting the mural. But it's a different kind of painting. Can we talk about that? How it's different in that sense too?
Well, I think one of the things that I've been talking about working here at LACMA with my team, and sort of refreshing my the story that I tell to my students, which is that it's like the closest thing I can analogy to it is like a dance. At a certain point, we come and we're uncoordinated with each other. We're out of step, and until we begin to find the rhythm with each other and the method of dancing together, and that our hands are actually coordinated, we're not painting a mural. And the thing about painting a mural has to do with seeing beyond what is in front of you, because what is in front of you is a piece of an eye. You can't see the whole eye, or a head that you're sitting in the middle of, and where's the rest of the head and where's the end of it? How do you envision the full scale, and how do you envision the relationship between different parts? So, cicadas used to talk about an echo. Something would go down the wall and would echo. So I was today this last week we were talking about how do we get the echo when we can't put 2,000 feet in a line because we're painting it in pieces because we're in an interior space. We're no longer in the river. So we've hit these problems that are about painting at scale and with a reduced amount of space to paint in scale. So how do you do it? How do you see? How do you envision to the peripheral vision, not to the edge of the canvas? How do you envision color that echoes across a space? How do you dance with somebody else whose hand is different than yours and trained different than yours, so that you can begin to apply the color in a way that looks like you cannot tell the difference between my hand and the next. And that's when you got it, when you can't see where one person ends and another begins.
Judy, I'm so I've always been struck by collaboration and that kind of space that you have to open up within your practice to allow other people to be present within it. I mean, looking at your process here in the setting that you're working in within LACMA, there's a give and take. You have a team, you have a crew, you have people who are doing your preliminary drawings who are absolutely amazing, and they also have to acquiesce. You're dancing with like a team of dancers, and then you're also kind of giving them space and then bringing them back, but also, I mean, I think even within the kind of arc of your 40 plus years of working, there's different ways to think about how we can talk about what you do, because it could be seen as when you were early on working with at-risk youth, that's one kind of a gang intervention program, and then you're establishing Spark at a moment where it's part of the Chicano movement and the women's movement, and then at another time we're also talking about it as praxis, and there's a kind of social public art movement that uses other language. I mean, how do you think about the way you articulate collaboration across all those different tendrils?
It's so interesting because you talk about social practice. And there's been so many community arts. I mean, the most denigrated term was community arts at the beginning, because that meant it was kiddie art that was not really serious art. So therefore, it never got real criticism, which is part of what you're bringing now as you with your work. It's like what we lacked was the kind of criticism that would make the form grow, that would actually look at it with sort of an intellect behind that viewing of it. Um, so very early on in my career, I was called first a gang member because they couldn't tell me from the kids, right? I mean, I just look like one of them, right? And then the other was, next I was like a social worker, right? I was a teacher. I was a gang leader. But I was never an artist. I was never called an artist. For all of the early writings you'll see, people could not bring themselves. There's that artist working in the river or working on these big scale works. That came much later, right? When people began to understand the value of it as actually a collaborative work. And collaboration also meant, I can't tell you how many times I've been in public spaces with people saying, which part did you paint? Right? Or people walked in and say, who did that part? Right? And then the answer, if I'm on it, is like, I don't remember because I can't tell the difference anymore. Right? So the collaboration is it's a scary thing, right? Because what you do is you give up space. You give up space to somebody else, to a group of people. You trust that they're going to have an idea that might teach you another step that you don't know. You trust that they're not going to be so off that you're going to be embarrassed, and sometimes you are, right? You can be. But the importance is that through the collaborative method, we hear the voices of so many different people who interpret history, for example. Because in fact, we know that somebody said to me the other day at LACMA, somebody walked through and said, Judy, you were writing history. And I stopped there for a minute. I thought, what? Is she talking about the art writing history? No, she's talking about the fact that we're interpreting history in such a way as that we are writing it. And I thought, that's good. That's good. That's what we want to do. We want to write history. We're not making an alternative history. We're writing history that exists, that was never acknowledged, that never was presented, and we're putting it into the public eye and into your consciousness.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and that's so important to rewrite art histories for this kind of process because that's what creates those histories. In fact, speaking of collaboration, we were talking about the fact that the mural you painted as you painted in the river from the Pleistocene, which looks like the tar pits, to the 50s, and here you are at LACMA continuing the timeline, and now you're in the 60s, and we're about to see the Watts Towers and the Watts Rebellion emerge, and you have the teacher walkouts, and this amazing phenomena happened that people are walking into the galleries who were there, and people are still alive who you're painting. And you told me an interesting story about a dialogue you had with someone who was a visitor that ended up impacting your editing your mural slightly. One of the signs, and so I'm thinking, oh wait, now the collaboration extends to the museum visitor who's interacting, who was there, right?
We were doing the East LA walkouts, and one of the signs, and maybe one of my team members remember the exact words of it, but the sign said, "No more racist teaching." Yeah, no more racist teachers. Right, no more racist teachers. They were basically, the students were demanding in the historical documentation, that's what they said. They were saying they wanted teachers that came from their own experience. They wanted people that were diverse in terms of culture to be teaching. And so we just used the sign. And the teacher walked in and she said, I was there, I was a teacher. And she confronted one of my team members and they said she was really, she didn't like it. And then I thought about it and I thought, oh, well, I'm sorry she didn't like it, but it's the truth. And then I thought, you know what? All we're talking about is racist teachings. We're not talking about necessarily racist teachers, although perhaps the person was a racist that was teaching incorrectly or was not giving them acknowledgement for their own cultural experiences. I mean, remember that this work was going on at a time in which the city of Los Angeles had a program for economically disadvantaged kids, which they called it was culturally disadvantaged, right? They didn't know the difference between culturally disadvantaged and economically disadvantaged. It took years, almost, I don't know, I witnessed some 25 years before they changed that terminology. So I went back and I looked at the sign and I said, would it hurt, and I sort of checked it out with people, if we just said no more racist teachings? And everybody said, no, it's the same thing. It works the same way. And therefore, we didn't put the blame on that teacher. She didn't have to come in and feel like she was being, hit on the head with it. Mm-hmm. But in truth, that's what we were talking about, the same thing. But I know it's also not offensive. So I think sometimes we get a piece of information that we are not thinking about how somebody else is going to feel, right? And I'm not saying that we need to moderate things so that it's soft sell and that it's easy for you to take. I hope it's hard for you to take sometimes. I hope it makes you examine how you have lived and what you think and how you'll be part of the change. We hope it does that.
I think what's so striking about what you're doing is that you're giving us a new way to think about monuments. You're giving us a new way to think about what we lift up and what we choose to remember. I mean, we know many of these images from historic photographs, but you're blending it, together in a narrative that we can then, have something to gravitate towards in a new way, in the realm of public space, in the context of public art, and that brings it into a new paradigm that challenges us to think about which stories and who is elevated, who are we choosing to think about historically, and whose stories. I mean,
I have to
they're
add.
here. They're here. I mean, that is a particular person you're talking about, but within the mural, there are many heroes and heroines
That's
who
right,
you're
yeah.
elevating out of the community and telling these stories and making sure that we know what the lessons they have to teach us.
Exactly. But there's a pretty interesting moment in which John Wiener, who was the co-author with Mike Davis's book and his book on the 60s, and he said something to us in his interview, because we have thought leaders who are helping us think about things and who've lived through an experience and who have things to say about how we should be thinking. Like um, Reverend Lawrence talked to us about the 60s being the most important thing is the end of Jim Crow, or at least the fact that people could not any longer advertise for ebony black person for restroom work, right? They had to change that kind of stuff. And so John Wiener said, everything you're looking at is taken from the perspective not of the people who are receiving the blows from the police, but from the perspective of people standing outside taking the photographs. So all the photographic documentation is not from the inside out. And I went, oh my God. Then we started looking at photographs, and it was true. Every one of these photographs, primarily in documentation, was not from the position of the people who were in the midst of the struggle. It was from those outside documenting it. So in other words, perspective is really so much the issue. And then defining those heroes and heroines that are not acknowledged. And they may be really small people who had something to do that was transformative, really important moments. And so we're always looking for those. And I mean, we just had a wonderful interview this week with Mama from Mama's Hot Tamales and her work on the transformation of MacArthur Park with tamales. That's going to be a really interesting image to make, right?
I love the way yes, and in your storytelling, I also love when you go to the Great Wall. One of my favorite moments is sort of how Thomas Edison becomes Tomas, and so you've also been able to dig into other histories and twist them and turn them, which is part of it too, right? It's not just to tell another story that you didn't know about, but actually try to retell some of the mainstream stories with a fresh perspective.
We saw some amazing documentation by a man who spent his whole life trying to prove that Thomas Edison was born in Mexico. And so he had all this documentation about history books in Mexico before the 20s, in which Edison was thought to be Mexican, Tomás Alva Edison, right? And that he was adopted in the U.S. Well, he didn't quite prove it, right? He didn't quite have enough documentation, but I thought, why can't the Chichimecas whisper in his ear?
It works so beautifully. Having been with you with some of our with our county supervisor recently, walking by the mural and talking about it ends obviously with that beautiful image of the Olympics. You were instrumental in over 80 murals, more than that even. Uh,
Actually, we did.
many murals for that Olympics in real space in real time. And then even at when you're finishing the Great Wall or continuing it, I guess, you have a bridge planned. Can you say something about that? I mean, you've been not just involved in your own work as an artist, even as a collaborator in your own circles, but you've taken responsibility to think about Los Angeles murals and what happens in our entire metropolis during the Olympics, or you're building a bridge over the river with state money, and you're involved in politics and officials. In fact, one of my favorite things that Delia Sophia and Deandra put in the exhibition with you is your first proposal to the city or the county for the mural, which is just like rainbows and birds flying. That's the story you're going to tell. So but you have this taste to be out there, and as somebody who like tries to do big things, it's not easy. Can you say something about that drive to build bridges and
it's
light?
a big mistake. I don't know how you do it.
You're doing it.
Well, I'm probably not doing it as well as we should be doing it. It's like it's taken us 10 years to put a footbridge over the river, and the footbridge was allowed to go into decay and be dangerous to the 3 schools that came across the river to catch the buses. It was a high school, a continuing school, and Valley Junior College. And the Rec and Parks Department just left it there, falling apart. Kids would climb on it. It was just a moment before somebody fell off of it and got killed, right? So I thought, we'll put another footbridge in, right? We'll just raise money. We'll put a footbridge in. Oh my God! You would think I was building a freeway. It's like a 5-lane freeway. We're there. We're about to get the thing up. We'll have it up by this June. It'll be going up this year. But there was so much difficulty in terms of. Thank you. I mean, I can't tell you how many people helped me with this. It was so difficult to do, and the prices just kept going up and up every time there was an obfuscation or a permit that wasn't given.
I just wanted to interject about the other part of what his question was about.
Yes, please.
About the long history of your work in supporting murals throughout Los Angeles and the many programs that you developed through Spark and the countless artists that you have supported through the Neighborhood Pride program and previous programs that have actually left an indelible mark on the city and have helped to establish Los Angeles as a public art and mural capital globally. You forgot that part. You left it out.
That's what we were. Thank you, Pilar.
And I also wanted to just say, like, another part of that I think is so amazing is, I mean, I of course came to LA in 2001 when the Neighborhood Pride program was in full swing, and in my observation, what I thought was so incredible was the methodology that you had about working with communities, and I think that was set the benchmark for the way that artists could work with communities, in communities. I think many times, we talk about this desire to not helicopter in and plop something into communities, especially communities of color, and then just run away and say, nobody wanted that in the first place. But, the way that you worked with communities through that project, I think was just really incredible. And in other opportunities where I've had to, sit on, maybe like a commission or review process for other public art projects, it seemed to me that this had lasting impact and that people were adopting that process, that you had set that in motion or set the benchmark for how people should operate. And I didn't know if you had comments about that or if you reflected on that in the same way.
It was, yes, and I thank you for that. And I did spend a great deal of my time getting artists commissions to produce works in various communities, and making certain that the artists that were presented to the community had a choice about that artist. So we did first. The question was, of course, how to get quality work and to keep the murals elevated. And so we would do first a call, and then we would select artists that were of the capacity to do a big scale work. And the first, of course, much to my surprise, that less than 15% of them were women in all the calls. Women were not thinking that they could make monumental work. So then that meant that I had to develop a program through the Women's Foundation and other funding to fund women so that they could be developed so that they could then apply. So in other words, it's like a rabbit hole. Every one of these things requires another thing, right? And then we would send artists out into community and they would present ideas for a particular place after a community meeting in which the community articulated their needs, what they felt was the most important things that they were facing. And the artist then would interpret that and then bring back that drawing to the community, and the community would have a say about who that, because we've already vetted that they were good enough people to do this. They had the aesthetic capacity. So those were long, laborious processes, and they have been distorted, I must admit, by various municipalities across the country, and have been made more difficult and obfuscated in so many different ways. But the essential truth was that there was a way that we could make relationships between people, artists as citizens, and people in a community, and that they could begin to voice what was happening in those places. And if you didn't want to do that kind of work, if you had an individual personal expression, then maybe you're better on an easel, right? Maybe that's the place where you get those works and get them into major exhibitions. That's important work. But for muralism, it's a public voice. It's a public practice. And it means that you have to be willing to deal with who is there and what they have to say. And then we hired kids to work with them. We hired people from the neighborhood so that they could be integrated within that group. And these amazing relationships happen. We funded over 105 murals in this way. We funded over 400 works before that in the first citywide mural project. And in every one of these cases, in the first 400, I remember the very first year that I ended up in front of the city council. I didn't mean to. I'm sorry. I was working in East LA painting at different parks because I was a teacher. And I wanted my kids paid, and I wanted the young men I was working with, primarily young boys, to have a job. And so I went to the city council and I argued that they should get paid and that they should have a job. And before I knew it, I ended up the director of East Los Angeles Murals. And I was in my 20s. I didn't know what I was doing, actually. All I knew was that this was a way that we could give people jobs, that we could actually begin to transform the neighborhoods through. So I ended up, down these rabbit holes, answering a question, and then there being another one, and then another. And that's how we did it. And so many women were given the first opportunities, and many graffiti artists were given their first opportunities to be commissioned. And we directed people who were vandals who were doing vandalization, and into a productive pattern of work, and gave them a chance to actually become more professional.
I have to say, the range of your work and thinking is just so impressive to me all the time as I learn more and more about it. And I think that point you made, Pilar, about the process of working with people to create something that they're invested in has also something to do with the sustainability of that art in public. It's very hard to maintain art in public. And the other thing it's been interesting to me, Varda's film ends with that question of the survival of murals. Is it part of the process that they change and they disappear, or do we try to sustain them? And I think that's a kind of, for all three of us, we're invested in this question of what is the legacy, what is the permanence. You're making your work very permanent. You're not shy about even new tools. Forget the past. You're working in new technology all the time. I mean, we did a project with you collaboratively with Snap where you created an augmented reality river, where you took the river and took it back to nature, which was so incredibly beautiful. And I know you're using and thinking about technology, not shy about how to use technology, I want to say, as activism against the erasure of murals, and this idea of archive and documentation that we're all involved in as a kind of activism to keep the stories out there. I wonder if you could say something about that. When the Denver airport, you said, when we were in the museum, you were giving me the tour of your MoLA show, and you're like, and we have a perfect digital copy, so if they get rid of it, we can put it back. And I just loved that idea of the new tools to make sure things those stories are out there for a long time.
That was a rabbit hole, right? The rabbit hole was we painted all these works, and then we started to watch them disappear. And what I realized is that the failure to provide maintenance through like our civic monies, our city monies, or our cultural distribution of artistic support was a way of censoring. So it's interesting that the Zapata got disappeared, right? And maybe something of the little girl reading a book didn't, right? So the more revolutionary, the more radical pieces didn't get to stay. So the question was, how did we deal with that? Censorship that occurs through lack of maintenance or restoration and so then we started to think about, was there a way that we could preserve this work digitally? And now there is a way that we can produce, we can record works, get them at the highest resolution so they can be reproduced at full scale and put back into into a public site. We're working on the issues of permanence because the works that go out back into a public site are typically printed, and the inks are not permanent. So we're looking at ways to try and find permanence within printing methods. And on glass, we have found a method that is pretty amazing for long-term sustainability in outdoor spaces. So that's actually a whole territory to begin to explore. And the other reason for the digital stuff was it had to do with the fact that increasingly, when I was dealing with authority, people who had rights over buildings, they had less and less training in the arts, that they became more and more profoundly ignorant. So I was having to create methods that say, we would show a drawing, we say it's going to go on this building. They could not imagine it on the building. So I thought, okay, we'll imagine it for you. So we would put it on the building, we'd fly them around it, we'd make them see it from different perspectives, and they could see it. But that was done digitally, and that made it easier for people to say, oh, that's a really good idea. But the other act of them making that synapse, making that connection, they couldn't do it. And so the technology came about as a need, right? Again, figuring out a way to answer the question that kept occurring. And also a way to maintain across the board, not just those things that were easy, but everything that might be of importance in a particular neighborhood. There was a great example of the Virgin of Guadalupe. At one point in the city, we counted 360 images of the Virgin of Guadalupe, right? We would do tours of the Virgin. You could go all these places and see different ways that artists had addressed painting the Virgin of Guadalupe. And essentially what they were saying, the artists were saying, this is Mexican friendly. We're a Korean market, but we're Mexican friendly, right? And over the years, because of the evangelists and they're not liking the what they call the Marianas, they didn't like people, focusing on the Virgin of Guadalupe. We started to see them destroyed. And so today, I would bet that you couldn't count 100, right? So what happened is that they started to be disappeared. And so it has to do with, the time that we're living in also, and in terms of how people perceive the work.
Yeah. I maybe just to bring it back to end with the film too. There's something so incredibly beautiful about that film, about how she kept capturing people in front of murals and the art and life line blurred so amazingly. And that was a theme I think that carried the whole film through, right? Especially, I love the Twitchell's mural and the wedding couples in the windows. There's nothing better than that, and all of that. But muralism, public art, it is very different, right? It is out in public. We don't always know the artist, and there's this kind of art and life thing going on that makes it a very different kind of art. Even where we don't even know the artist, I have to say, Chris Burden said to me very towards the end of his life that he knew that Urban Light, that nobody knew who made it, and that was okay. But this art and life thing in public is very different, even for art historians, I think, to think about, because it's not just looking at the picture in a museum. And I don't know how that, upon reflection of all these years of working outdoors in public, studying it, the art life thing happens in muralism in a way that it doesn't happen in any other way, any other discipline, medium.
I was just thinking about the research that that I've done or that other folks in my field have done to also scour photography of murals that are no longer in situ, that once were there in the 70s and 80s, and that we're trying to find out, the names of artists. But there's photographic archives that might be at UCLA, and trying to make sure that we're still, you know, documenting the names, writing the histories of those particular artists, because their imagery also left a legacy for other generations of artists. So there was an impact still, because they would create iconographies, whether that be, a Virgen or something else that contributed to a lexicon of, let's say, Chicano art, or art from East LA, or something else that left a lasting impression that then gets reinterpreted over time. And we want to know those stories. We want to know those histories. They're in the public domain. And other people who are coming up, are seeing that, interpreting it, experiencing it, feeling it. They don't know who those artists are. And as historians, we also have a hard time tracing, the exact origin story, because many of the programs proliferated around what we're talking about that Judy was involved in. But things sprung up, and we need to know that story too. But it's all important, because it's part of the way that you're kind of living and breathing the city.
But it's also true that it's the backdrop. Public art and these murals are the backdrop for other people's their moments themselves, and that's something very different than a museum where you're kind of worshiping the art. And
It's interactivity.
it's interactivity, right?
It's
It's
the way
this
the public
way of being
relates.
yourself.
Right. It's the way the public relates to it, and it's all, it's like, I've had the experience of going to the Great Wall. At one point, I was waiting for somebody to do a tour. I was going to go take somebody on a tour. It was an international visitor, and so I was standing outside, and a person was late, and there was a group of little old ladies walking down the mural, and there was a white-haired, tiny little woman leading the tour, and she was giving people a historical reading of the mural. And I got really interested in listening to her. And so I got on her tour. And I watched her talk about, and she was really quite accurate. I mean, she had really figured it out. And she got to the end, and she said, and I don't really know who this Billy Mills guy is, right? And why Judy Baca put this in the mural. And she turned around and she said, I was just one of the public, right, at that point. She didn't know it was me. And she said, do you know? You have an idea? I said, kinda, I do. And so I told her the story of Billy Mills, how he was a Dakota Sioux. He was in the boarding school movement. He's running in the Olympics. He's a sprinter. He's running way too fast on his time. And every time he looks up to kind of get his pace right, he sees all of these Dakotas in the audience. Of course, they were probably apparitions, right? And he wins. And so when he's running across the finish line, they say, who are you? Who are you? And they have to find out his name, because they never expected him to win. And so I told that story, and she goes, that's a great story. How do you know? So it had its own life, and I could be part of the life as a member of the public. And I had to say something about Agnes's last part of that film. You have to remember that she was doing this in the 80s. And this was the time already when we had lost our funding. We were starting to lose the support. And so we were losing murals because the code of the street was leaving. The code of the street said you don't write on a mural. You write on the wall next to it. But as there became less and less opportunities for young people to think about, or graffiti artists to think about being able to do their own work, they began to be disrespectful, and we started losing more and more works. So which you're also chronicling, and I think actually our art historians and our people who are looking at policy need to be looking at how policies have transformed the landscape of LA, how they have destroyed a mural movement, which we were the mural capital of the world at one point. And we made a decision. We made a hard decision purposefully to make that happen. And I rail against that.
And luckily, just want to say, luckily, we have a spirit forward. I feel lucky, Pilar, that you're at the helm, preserving, protecting, telling those stories, and you have that deep connection. And Judy, you can take us forward with the mural you're painting right here, right now, in the river, beyond, and your energy that's going to take us to that place of public murals in the future. And we're incredibly grateful for your presence here and also for being here tonight, both of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.